Russia has the population of a giant, 140 million people. On paper, that is a fortress of flesh and blood that no one can starve out a reservoir of soldiers so deep it should never run dry. That is exactly what Vladimir Putin has been betting on for 3 years. Send one wave, then the next, then the one after that. Burn through men like firewood because there is always more coming. That was the logic. That was the fortress. But today there is a crack in that fortress. For the 5th month in a row, the math points in only one direction, and it is not Moscow's direction. The well Putin has been drawing from is running dry. Fewer and fewer people are willing to march into this war and die in it. And no amount of propaganda, no threat, no signing bonus, however large, seems able to make the spring flow again. What happens to an army that dies faster than it can replace itself? How long before the bonuses can no longer buy bodies? Let's take a look at how the one weapon the Kremlin is powerless against plain arithmetic is finally turning on the man who believed he could never run out of soldiers. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, you first have to understand how fearsome the Russian war machine truly was, and in many ways still is. Because this is not a weak enemy that simply falls apart on its own. This is a colossus. Since the days of Stalin, Moscow has followed an iron doctrine: mass beats finesse. Human lives are raw material. You throw soldiers at a position until it falls, no matter how high the cost in blood. This strategy of attrition has a name, and the CSIS, the respected Washington think tank, calls it exactly what it is. Russia has knowingly accepted the cost of enormous losses, hoping to grind down Ukraine's army and society over time. And for a long stretch, that bet seemed to be paying off. In 2024, Russia beat its own recruitment targets. According to Ukrainian military intelligence, roughly 440,000 men signed a contract with the defense ministry that year. The bonuses flowed, the ranks filled, and the pressure on cities like Pokrovsk never let up. Wave after wave, month after month. Putin had even ordered his military to grow to 1.5 million troops by 2026, one of the largest armies on Earth. By official accounts, some 417,000 men signed contracts in 2025 alone. Anyone looking at those numbers saw a war machine filling up faster than Ukraine could empty it. In the West, the fear grew that in the end, sheer size would decide everything. Russia had the upper hand, it was much bigger, much stronger, and at some point, size would win even U.S. President Donald Trump put it that way. It was the prevailing assumption in many capitals all the way into the White House. A Russian victory was inevitable, just a matter of time. You can understand why. A country of 140 million people with tens of millions of fighting-age men with a leadership willing to spend them sounds like an inexhaustible source. Like a fortress you cannot storm, cannot starve, cannot break. Putin, it seemed, was sitting on a mountain of men tall enough to last a dozen wars. That is the picture you need to hold in your head, the seemingly invulnerable giant. The bottomless reserve, the fortress of numbers. But today, reality looks different. For the first time in this war, the Kremlin is systematically losing more soldiers than it can recruit, and not for 1 month, but month after month after month. The bottomless reserve has a bottom, and Russia is hitting it right now. Let's start with the raw numbers. On May 20th, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, stood before the Ukraine NATO Council in Brussels. His tally: since the start of 2026, Russia had lost more than 140,000 soldiers, over 83,000 of them irrecoverable, killed, or permanently out of action. Every single day, Syrsky said the Russian army loses at least 1,000 men killed and wounded. Now, let's be fair. These overall figures come from Ukraine's general staff, a party to the war with every incentive to make the enemy's losses look large. If the story ended there, you could dismiss it as propaganda. But it does not end there. Because the trend, and this is the crucial part, is confirmed by the West. The UK Ministry of Defense, drawing on its own assessments, puts average Russian losses at around 1,500 men a day over recent months. And Bloomberg reported back in January, citing its own sources, that in that month alone, the Russian army lost 9,000 more soldiers than it could recruit in volunteers. Britain's Defense Secretary John Healey confirmed the same trend. 3 independent Western sources, the same conclusion. This can no longer be waved away. How deadly this attrition becomes on individual stretches of the front shows in one example. At Kupiansk, British intelligence reported a ratio at one point of 27 to 127 Russians killed for every Ukrainian soldier lost. Where the ratio used to sit at 6 or 7 to 1, on some sectors it has climbed to 20 to 1 and beyond. That is not a battle. That is a slaughterhouse. But how big is this bloodletting in historical terms? Here, the CSIS delivers what may be the most staggering number of the entire war. Since February 2022, Russia has suffered roughly 2 million casualties killed, wounded, and missing, including as many as 325,000 dead. No major power, the CSIS notes, has come anywhere close to such losses since the Second World War. Let those comparisons sink in. Russia's dead in Ukraine exceed Soviet fatalities in Afghanistan by more than 17-fold. They are 11 times higher than both Chechen wars combined, and they surpass every Russian and Soviet war since 1945, put together by more than 5 times over. Afghanistan, the war that helped drag the Soviet Union into the abyss, was a skirmish by comparison. And this bloodletting is accelerating year over year. In 2025 alone, the CSIS counted around 415,000 Russian casualties, an average of nearly 35,000 men a month. In the first 3 months of 2026, President Zelensky reported some 89,000 killed and seriously wounded on the Russian side. The curve is not bending down, it is climbing steeply upward. An army can absorb heavy losses for a while as long as fresh men keep coming. But losses that rise year after year, while reinforcements fall month after month, that is the definition of a pair of scissors opening wider and wider. And sooner or later, scissors like that cut through everything between the blades, even an army of 1 million men. That is exactly what makes this 5th straight month so dangerous. It is no longer a fluke, it is a pattern. And for what price? For almost nothing. In their most prominent offensive, the push on Pokrovsk, Russian troops advanced an average of just 70 meters a day. 70 meters. That is slower than the bloodiest battles of the last century, slower even than the Somme in the First World War. Since the start of 2024, Russia has taken less than 1.5% of Ukrainian territory, an empire bleeding out for a few meters of mud. And that is precisely why the CSIS speaks not of a rising power, but of a declining one. A war economy under mounting strain, shrinking industrial output growth of barely 0.5%. This is where the front turns into a grinder. It stretches across 1,200 kilometers, and for every one of those kilometers, President Zelensky says Russia loses more than 170 soldiers. But the real story is in the price per square kilometer. In 2025, every captured square kilometer cost Russia around 120 men. In 2026, it is as many as 316. In April, in the Donetsk region, the Russian army needed roughly 470 soldiers to take a single square kilometer. 470 lives for a patch of ground you can barely find on a map. That same April, Russian forces advanced just 53 square kilometers in Donetsk and lost around 25,000 soldiers on that one axis doing it. What changed the drones? For a few $100s apiece, Ukrainian FPV drones comb the battlefield and turn every assault into a deadly gauntlet. A weapon cheaper than a smartphone is grinding down a force that swallows billions. Syrskyi himself says his drone units are the main reason Russia's losses now outrun its recruitment. The lifeline that pumps men to the front is being severed drop by drop, not by a grand counteroffensive, but by thousands of tiny machines in the sky. And these drones do not only hit soldiers in the trenches. According to Syrskyi, Ukrainian deep strikes have now inflicted around $25.5 billion in damage on Russia's war machine, hitting oil refineries, fuel depots, logistics hubs, and defense plants deep inside Russia. In other words, while one of Moscow's hands reaches desperately for new recruits, the other, the industry, the logistics, the fuel, is being cut off piece by piece. Both lifelines are bleeding at once. And it is not only the men running out, it is the steel too. Open source analysts and satellite imagery show that over the course of the war, Russia has lost more than 4,000 main battle tanks, more than the United Kingdom, France, and Germany own combined. The entire active fleet of once modern T-80S is considered spent, the T-90 reserves in storage exhausted. So Moscow is reaching ever deeper into the Soviet attic. 50-year-old T-72. As are being dragged off scrapyards along with T-62S from the 60s and even T-55S from the 50s, tanks that belong in museums not at the front. Let's be honest here, this is not a sudden collapse. Russia still holds sizable strategic reserves, and the decline is gradual, a shift to ever older, ever harder to revive hulls. But the direction is unmistakable. Analysts estimate that well over 80% of pre-war stockpiles have been used up, while domestic industry replaces less than a quarter of what is lost. A nation that sends its men to die on rusting tanks has long since broken into the reserves it was saving for darker days. And while the front devours men, the source that is supposed to replace them is drying up. For 2026, Moscow set out to recruit more than 400,000 new soldiers, according to Ukraine's intelligence chief Budanov. But the economist Janis Klug, a careful watcher of Russian budget data, reaches a sobering verdict. In the first quarter of 2026, recruitment fell by around 20% to roughly 800 men a day. At the same time, the regions were paying out compensation for 250 to 300 soldiers killed every single day. Do the math. 800 come in, at least 1,000 fall. That is no longer a deficit, it is a slow bleed. The targeted pace has dropped from around 1,100 to about 940 men a day, and it keeps sinking. And Moscow feels it. In desperation, Russia's regions are turning the money screw again. According to reports from the Moscow Times and Novaya Gazeta, almost all the regions that cut their signing bonuses at the end of 2025 raised them again in 2026 to the highest levels since the war began. Not because the coffers can afford it, but because pressure from Moscow to meet the quotas weighs heavier than any budget deficit. Some recruits get the equivalent of $25,000 for a single signature. But here is the bitter irony. The more money flows, the fewer men come. The bonuses climb, the response shrinks. And to fill the ranks at all, the Kremlin reaches ever further toward the most vulnerable. By some estimates, around 40% of new soldiers now come from marginalized groups. Convicts, the heavily indebted men, handed a choice between prison and the trench. An army that can no longer convince its own citizens buys its soldiers piecemeal, and even that is working worse by the month. And where money no longer lures, coercion follows. At times, Russia was spending the equivalent of more than $20 million a day on one-time signing bonuses alone. The Samara region offered a record bonus of around $40,000 at one point, and even that brought almost no new men to the front. When record bonuses fizzle, all that is left is the thumbscrew. Observers report that enterprises are pressured to supply a set number of volunteers, that men are leaned on, that conscripts are pushed to sign contracts. What began as a transaction money for blood is turning more and more into a hunt. But the deepest wound is invisible. Because when you build an army out of convicts, debtors, and coerced men, you do not get a force of professionals, you get cannon fodder. And the worse trained a soldier is, the faster he falls, which in turn demands even more reinforcements. It is a death spiral. Bad troops produce heavy losses demand still more bad troops. Reports from the field paint a grim picture: wounded men sent back into combat, commanders stamping out any attempt to surrender. A machine burning through its own parts faster than it can make new ones. So if your own citizens are not enough and the convicts are not enough, where does an empire find men? Then the answer may be the clearest admission of weakness yet. Russia is importing its soldiers. At the Munich Security Conference, Britain's Defense Secretary Healey said Moscow is increasingly dependent on foreign personnel. Some 17,000 soldiers from North Korea were already fighting on Russia's side. On top of that, citizens of India, Pakistan, Nepal, Cuba, Nigeria, and Senegal, many of them, Healey said, recruited under false pretenses, pressed into service without realizing they were destined for the Russian meat machine on the Ukrainian front. Let that sink in for a moment. A self-styled great power heir to an empire that once challenged half the world is now luring civil engineering students from Africa and desperate workers from South Asia into its trenches. History knows this pattern. Dying empires have always thrown mercenaries and foreigners into the cracks their own sons no longer wanted to fill, from the late Roman Empire to today. It is not a sign of strength. It is the sound of a foundation beginning to crumble. The North Koreans in particular deserve a second look. The fact that a nuclear power like Russia is reaching for soldiers from Pyongyang is more than an embarrassment, it is a geopolitical signal. It binds Moscow ever tighter to North Korea and in the background to Beijing. It shows how deeply this war has driven Russia into dependence on partners it would barely have needed a few years ago. A great power that fights its battles with borrowed men is not only losing at the front, it is losing its rank. And that brings us to the real trap, the trap Putin set for himself. Because an empty well can only be refilled two ways. The first is volunteers. That road, as we have seen, is drying up. That leaves the second general mobilization, the big call-up. The order that would force millions of Russian men into uniform. But that is the one lever Putin cannot pull. And the reason lies not at the front, but in Russia's living rooms. Polls by the independent Levada Center and other institutes show that between 50 and 60% of Russians reject a second wave of mobilization. Just 8% view it positively. Analysts call that a near prohibitive factor, an almost insurmountable wall in front of any decision the Kremlin might make. Putin knows why. When he announced partial mobilization in the fall of 2022, fear in the population spiked overnight. The share of people feeling tension, dread, and despair jumped from 21 to 47%, the sharpest single shift in public mood since the early 1990s. Hundreds of thousands fled the country. How to leave Russia became one of the most searched phrases on the Russian internet. Even the director of the Levada Center admitted that if the Kremlin could have avoided that decision, it would have. So here sits the man in the trap. Mobilize and he risks blowing the home front wide open. Don't mobilize and his army keeps bleeding out. Both roads lead downhill, and history knows how this movie ends. In 1917, it was not a single lost battle that toppled the Russian Empire. It was sheer exhaustion. An army bled white. a homeland that could not take any more. The empire of the Romanovs did not collapse from the outside. It collapsed from within. And here lies the strategic point that matters for the West. For years, the comfortable assumption held that Russia could simply outlast this war, endure longer, suffer more, and win in the end through sheer size. The CSIS and the reality at the front call exactly that assumption into question. A power that has to import its soldiers, pull its tanks out of museums, and drive its own population to the front with money and coercion is not a rising great power. It is one burning through its own substance. Time, it turns out, may not be working for Moscow at all. It is working against the Kremlin. No one here is saying Russia's army falls apart tomorrow. It keeps up the pressure, it keeps attacking, and it is far from beaten. But a trend that holds month after month is not a snapshot, it is a direction. And that direction is not sustainable over the long run. The Kremlin can hide the death toll from its own people. It cannot hide from the math. Which brings us to you. How long can an army keep fighting when it dies faster than it can renew itself? And at what point does a deficit become a break? Share your take in the comments. We read every one, and the sharpest thoughts often come from you. If you appreciate analysis like this, battlefield strategies, and the balance of power behind the headlines, then subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. That way, you won't miss a new episode, especially now when the situation on this front is shifting week by week. And if you're on the move on long drives or long journeys, you can find these breakdowns as audio on Spotify too. The whole story to listen to whenever it suits you. One last thing to take with you. Ukraine's stated goal for this summer is to drive Russian losses up to 50,000 to 60,000 men a month. If that succeeds, then in the assessment of several observers, even a general mobilization would no longer save the situation. In other words, the gap between losses and reinforcements could soon grow so wide that Putin is left with no calm choice at all, only two bad ones. We will be watching closely to see whether that gap finally forces his hand. Until then, keep your eye on the numbers, because in this war, the numbers lie the least.